session on the importance of traditional foods and biodiversity for Indigenous peoples' nutrition and food security. My name is Anne Brunel, and I am member of the Indigenous Peoples Unit at FAO and co-coordinator of the Global Hub on Indigenous People Food Systems. I would like first to thank the organizers for inviting the Global Hub to this dedicated session of the day which focus on consumption. So thank you so much, the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. We will have a discussion time during the session, so that I encourage you to ask your questions on the speakers in the comment chat box. Last but not least, I would like to kindly ask the speakers to mind the speaking time. The organizers indicated that the session need to stop really at 2 p.m. Rome time for a good flow of the Congress. With no further ado, I would like to welcome our first speakers from some opening remarks. And so Dr. Maximo Torero to speak. You are Chief Economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The floor is yours. Thank you, Massimo.
Thank you so much, and good morning, Excellencies, Indigenous people, distinguished panelists and participants. I am very glad to be here today on behalf of FAO, as I have been in many of your meetings, because FAO considers Indigenous peoples as key allies on the path towards more sustainable and resilient agri-food systems. Their holistic approach, as I always mention, to agri-food systems, recognize the intrinsic relationship between nutrition, food security, resilience, and biodiversity. So it creates a linkage between the nature, the climate, and what we need, which is healthy diets and access to healthy diets. FAO does not understand agri-food systems without agrobiodiversity, the same that Indigenous peoples do not understand their food and knowledge systems without biodiversity. It is important to maintain these frameworks as we move towards more sustainable food systems in the post-UN Food Systems Summit and COP26. It's important to make understand the COP26 and, of course, the summit, that there is no way we can resolve the climate problem without touching and looking at the agri-food systems in a holistic way. The systemic approach that Indigenous peoples have when they look at their food systems, their cosmogony, territorial management, culture, and governance is intrinsically related to their surrounding ecosystems and their biodiversity. This unique systemic approach of understanding nature, food, culture, and society is a valid model from which to extract lessons that can inform researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. COP26 has reminded us all that a lot of evidence on the sustainability and resilience of Indigenous people food systems has already been shared. In 2021, FAO and the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT recently released a publication entitled Indigenous People Food Systems, Insights on Sustainability and Climate Resilience from the Front Line of Climate Change. And this publication was also shared to the scientific group in the Food Systems Summit. This book includes insights on how 8 Indigenous peoples' food systems provide livelihoods and well-being to the communities involved, while preserving and enhancing the natural resource and the health of ecosystems in their ancestral customary land. As a result, its scientific rigor and contribution to current debates, the book received the Halbar Award as the best publication about sustainability in 2021. In addition, FAO is proud to host the Global Hub on Indigenous People Food Systems since its endorsement by member countries at the last Technical Committee on Agriculture in September 2020. The Global Hub is a knowledge platform that gathers 19 members, including Indigenous people, research and university centers, and the UN organizations. The Alliance for Biodiversity International and CIAT is one of the 6 founding members, and we would like to acknowledge its key role in the functioning of the Global Hub. We hope that our great collaboration will continue and amplify. The main objective of the Global Hub is to co-create knowledge relying on Indigenous people traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge with the same level of respect and recognition. In this context, the Global Hub on Indigenous People Food Systems coordinated the writing of the Waipala paper on Indigenous people's food systems that gives clear evidence on the many aspects of sustainability and resilience of Indigenous people food systems. The Waipala paper completed 16 contributions from 6 sociocultural regions. The document was pivotal in the creation of the Coalition on Indigenous People Foods as one of the outcomes of the UN Food Systems Summit. In particular, the coalition will work on scaling up Indigenous people food systems by strengthening intercultural co-creation processes, scientific and empirical research. In addition, the Indigenous people will be directly linked to the hub to be hosted at FAO to follow up of the summit activities through the stakeholder unit of support. I take this opportunity to reaffirm FAO commitment through the Global Hub to work with Rome-based agencies in the frame of the Coalition on Indigenous People Food Systems. I hope that the discussion today and during the second Agrobiodiversity conference in general will provide further insights and inspiration on how to advance together. Advance together towards in a process of co-creation of knowledge that respects indigenous peoples, food and knowledge systems, and further co-organizes their essential role in protecting the remaining biodiversity in this planet. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great meeting today. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Maximo Torero, for these opening remarks. Indigenous peoples' food systems indeed adopt a holistic approach to food that can inform policy discussions and research agenda. Thank you very much for reaffirming the commitment of FAO to work with indigenous peoples and Rome-based agencies in the context of the Global Hub and the Coalition on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. I would like now to invite our next speaker to the floor, His Excellency Miguel Garcia Winder, the Ambassador of Mexico and Chair of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples in Rome. His Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I think we have gone through a very detailed preparation, but we never consider electricity. We just have a shortage of electricity here. So I'm talking to you through our phone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all the indigenous people, to your excellencies, to colleagues and friends all around the world. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this Congress. But more importantly, I want to thank the organizers for allowing indigenous people participation and involvement in the discussion of this topic. Personally, I am deeply honored, and more than honored, I always humble, sharing this stage with all of you today in my capacity as chair of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples here in Rome. Every time that I have the opportunity to listen to all of you, especially to the indigenous elders and indigenous people representatives, I become convinced that their values, your knowledge, and your love for Mother Earth will help us to build a better future. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Tania Martinez Cruz, who will be sharing the stage today, for sharing with me, Tania, your knowledge, and also to John Fernandez and his team. Thank you. I hope I will not misrepresent your contributions. The organizers have asked me to reflect on why I consider indigenous people's food systems to be an important game changer in the issues of biodiversity and in the transformation of food systems, and into addressing the present challenge of our generation. I believe that there are 5 reasons that why indigenous people food systems are important. These reasons you can be found in the Hawaii Pala paper that Dr. Torero just made reference, and that was created by the Global Hub. By the way, I expect the Global Hub will continue to provide scientific and empirical evidence on the importance of indigenous people food systems. The elements that I believe are important and you can find in the indigenous people food systems are, first of all, the holistic vision and comprehension that indigenous people have of their food systems. This vision is very critical, I believe, in transforming, or is very critical in the success of the food systems. They deal with the inexorably important relationships that exist between the different components of the ecosystems, and demonstrate that we humans are not the owners of the ecosystems, but a part of it. And that if we do not take care of the entire ecosystem, we are killing ourselves little by little. So this is the first characteristic, the holistic vision that they have. The second characteristic that I think is very important and provide elements for other systems is their governance mechanisms. Despite the subtle differences that exist in many particular food systems, indigenous systems give priority to solidarity and favor those in greater need. And I believe this is vital in our quest to find new development paradigms that should be centered in the dignity of the human person. So this is the second one, their ability to be solidarity. The third characteristic that I believe indigenous people food systems can be of importance for the future is the abundance of knowledge. This knowledge could inform scientific research in ways that we have not experienced today. So that's the third characteristic. The fourth characteristic that I believe is important in the food system, in the indigenous food system, is the richness of the diet, the complexity of the diet, and the simplicity of the diet. They make a larger use of all food staples, of all resources in the territory, reducing the dependency on few commodities and adapting to the changes of seasons, which could help in situations like the one we are facing today, and help us to cope with disruption in markets and shock in global value chains. Finally, the fifth characteristic that I believe indigenous people food system bring into the conversation and for the transformation of the world is their resilience. The resilience that comes from the respect and the understanding of biodiversity and natural resources. This is quite important if we want to really address the issues of climate change, the planetary boundaries, and create biodiversity and create food resistance. Before I conclude my intervention, I would like to invite all of you that are listening today to join us in the coalition of the Indigenous People Food System. This is a global initiative oriented to transform the food systems as we know, and that has arisen from the food system process. This coalition is led by indigenous people. I had to make this clear. It's led by indigenous people from all the biocultural regions of the world. But it has also been promoted by 7 countries, including my own, that will work on strengthening indigenous people food systems and in identifying knowledge in the path toward a more sustainable food system. I encourage every one of us to join this effort. We need the contribution of all, from governments to academy, from research to entrepreneurs, from city dwellers to indigenous people. Only by working together, we can achieve the goal of restoring and protecting biodiversity and to stop climate change and environmental degradation. Indigenous people food systems have a critical role to play. I encourage you to contact Anne Norgan or John Fernandez to join us in this coalition. I would like to finish by expressing one issue that I consider very important. Joining the coalition and making this coalition work is not only about indigenous people. Many people believe it's only about indigenous people. Yes, it is. It is to protect, to enhance the rights, to recognize the potential role, but it's also for the entire world. If we do not learn from indigenous people, we are putting our world at risk. In closing, allow me to reiterate that without indigenous people food systems, knowledge, and systems, we are not only negating how close to 500 million people live today across the world. We are also losing a tremendous opportunity to learn how to generate food without eliminating biodiversity. Please join us in this effort. Biodiversity will thank, and Mother Earth will thank us for reversing what we have done to them. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you so much, His Excellency Miguel, for this very strong introduction remark. I think we heard the call to join the coalition and join forces towards the preservation and strengthening of indigenous people food systems. Thank you so much. I would like now to invite our next speaker to take the floor. Mr. Frank Roy, you are indigenous leader belonging to the Kashi people in India. You are coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Partnerships on Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty. The Indigenous Partnership is a member of the Global Hub, and you have been involved in the summit. What is your message today for the attendees of the Congress? Frank, you have the floor.
Thank you, Anne. The uniqueness of human beings is our capacity to develop stories and believe in collective imaginations, according to Yuval Noah Harari, the acclaimed historian and philosopher of our time. Indigenous peoples have many stories, but there is one common story that has given them the values of caring, of sharing, and consensus building. It is their story of their sacred relationship with nature. The indigenous peoples of Eastern Polynesia bury the placenta of a newborn at the base of a fruit tree so that the substance that nourishes the fetus nourishes the tree. The Khasis of Northeast India and the Karens of Southeast Asia have similar traditions. These values help indigenous peoples to preserve about 80% of the remaining biodiversity of the world. For them, there is no agriculture without agrobiodiversity. Their food systems are in fact productive, equitable, and sustainable. And according to McGill University, in some cases, some indigenous communities have already achieved zero hunger. In March 2021, the Indigenous Partnership, in collaboration with FAO and its local partner, NSFAS, studied the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity in 18 indigenous villages in Northeast India, using FAO's Food Insecurity Experience Scale. The study showed that severe food insecurity is virtually non-existent in these 18 villages, while moderate food insecurity in 2020 was experienced at 11.3%, as against South Asia level of 43.8% and the global level of 30.38%. Yet despite these credentials of indigenous peoples, their food systems are often marginalized by agriculture systems that are driven essentially by monocropping, by domination, by commodification and profit. They are being disturbed by extractive industries, hydro projects, and industrial agriculture. We are therefore grateful to Juan Lucas and friends in the Alliance of Biodiversity, CIAT, and to this Congress for acknowledging the indigenous food system. We hope that we will now start a new venture as a joint follow-up to the UN Food System Summit and COP26. We are grateful to FAO for initiating the Global Hub for Indigenous Peoples Food System that brings together indigenous and non-indigenous scientists, knowledge holders, and UN staff to generate evidence on the resilience of indigenous people's food system, as is excellently stated. Today, as after COP26, we all desperately need to craft a new agrobiodiversity story that will create an environment where the wonders of contemporary science and traditional wisdom are equitably blended. In short, we need a change where we all become a little bit more indigenous and a little bit more scientific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for your opening remarks. I think we hear the real importance of considering indigenous people's food systems as we move towards more sustainable food systems across the world. Thank you very much for your strong statements. I would like now to start our technical discussion. And in this context, I would like to invite Tania Olala Martinez-Cruz to take the floor. Tania is a Ayuk woman from Mexico and research consultant on indigenous people's food systems and nutrition at the University of Greenwich. Tania, our previous speaker has mentioned the White Wipala paper on indigenous people's food systems. Can you please highlight in the paper evidence on the importance of biodiversity and nutrition for food security of indigenous peoples? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. I think there's a lot of overlapping on what the previous speaker said, which I am really grateful for, because it means that we are conveying, or I hope we are conveying, a strong message. And I hope the audience join us and what we can learn from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous food systems. So let me share my screen. Should be working now. Let's see. Yes, now it is working. So some of the lessons that I will share today are gathered in the Wipala white paper that Dr. Maximo Torrero and Dr. Miguel and Fran Roy have mentioned before. So as Dr. Miguel have mentioned before, I think one of the questions that we are asked continuously is that why should we care about Indigenous food systems, Indigenous people's food systems, and Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples when the population is not so high? So yes, to start, I think it's a matter of rights, but secondly, evidence shows that Indigenous peoples have been safeguarding the 80% of the biodiversity of the world and in less than the 25% of the territory, which means now that just happened the COP26 last week, and we are facing the climate crisis, and we are thinking on how we're going to be adapting to the new changing conditions. There's a lot to learn from Indigenous populations. This Congress and this conference is focused on agrobiodiversity, but I would like to say that I think we should change with the narrative from the perspectives of Indigenous peoples to start first, because it's not only about food, but also about all the things that we get from the nature and the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the environments, which can be shelter, medicine, etc. I think traditionally, the dominant paradigms in agriculture have focused on three major crops, which contribute to the 60% of the calorie intake in the world, which is maize, wheat, and rice. But there are much more foods beyond that. And I think when we talk about food policies in general, we tend to think about Indigenous foods as something with a less value, but there's a lot of evidence of what we could learn and uptake from Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people's food systems. So in general words, Indigenous people's food systems are well placed to contribute to the global debates on sustainable food systems. As I mentioned before, it's linked to the biodiversity, to the health of the planet. And they have shown us through the years that they have been adapting to different changing environments, even though some drivers have put them at the edge when there's like a lot of processes of marginalization. Still they preserve biodiversity and are essential for the planet. But also, contrary to how we conceptualize food systems, let's talk about the dominant paradigm where we think a lot on productivity. Indigenous peoples see their systems in a different way. They are not linear chains, it's holistic, but also something else. It's not only about production, but also about gathering. But I will explain this in some minutes with some other examples. So with the past UNA Food System Summit, something that we tried, a group of people as part of the Global Hub of Indigenous People's Food System tried to do was to push forward the key role of Indigenous people's knowledge and food systems as game changers. Yes, to fight hunger, at the same time, to fight the climate crisis that we are facing these days. All this evidence was gathered in the White Wipala paper, as some of the previous speakers have mentioned. And this is a collective effort of the Global Hub on Indigenous people's food system. I'm not going to detail much more on this now because some of the previous speakers have done this already, but just to tell you that we are working collectively to gather evidence, facilitate dialogue, and to put in the agenda at policy level on the key role of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous people's food systems. So the Wipala paper, which was one publication accepted by the Scientific Committee on the United Nations Food Systems, gathered contributions from different sociocultural regions of the world. I invite you to read it if you haven't read it yet, because it really will show you how Indigenous populations have adapted and can to different practices, knowing the environments and their territories, their homes, provide sustainable lessons to the world. So we say that there are 5 elements that are key on indigenous peoples' food systems, which are the cosmogony, territorial management, traditional knowledge, governance, and value systems that are based on reciprocity. So in cosmogony, I think in general, we don't think of people as something separated from nature. It's quite common to see in different regions of the world that before planting a plant, a seed, or harvesting a crop, or fishing, there are several rituals performed to thank to the Mother Earth, or in different languages to show again this linkage that indigenous peoples have with nature. So it's, in other words, we say also that we belong more, or we are an element of Mother Earth, but not necessarily that we can commodify nature, but more like we are interacting in a different way with it. Traditional knowledge has made indigenous communities resilient. I think one of the points where we have sometimes tensions with the scientific community is on the way in which we gather evidence and what shows that this is actually a knowledge that can be replicated or we can learn from. It's working through a different system, which is usually through orality. And one of the examples I love giving is a link to the Green Revolution in several regions of the world, even though there were many policies that focus on promoting improved crops. Many of the indigenous peoples stay with the seeds. One, because when we talk about improved crops, many times or improved seeds, they require ideal conditions of irrigation, inputs, etc. And farmers had adapted already for many generations their seeds to specific conditions in their environments. So if we think about this knowledge as something essential that people has adapted, their seeds, their crops, their knowledge, they have learned to read to the season what's available to eat in summer, in spring, in winter, in the Arctic, in the desert. There's a lot of knowledge there that if it's documented and passed in a different way, but still it's valuable, and that's something that we need to learn from. The territorial management, I was mentioning about food generation and food production. So recently, one of our colleagues, Paulina, I hope she managed to join us later, she was explaining to me recently how in the Arctic region, because they also have a really short days in a specific period of the year, they can get vitamin D from the deer they hunt or other foods, fish they hunt. And in that way, they can also keep healthy. But again, this is something that many people undermines. And there's a lot of knowledge in that. I also refer to the people in the desert, the Tohono people in the desert in Arizona. When you have a dry season in summer, when you're reaching above 40 Celsius degrees, still people can go and harvest some of the saguaros and live from the sugar they can get from the cactus. So there's the territorial management becomes crucial because indigenous peoples, that's why they defend their territories. If they get displaced, taken away from their hands, that also means their resilience and their ability to cope with change. They become more vulnerable, or they are made vulnerable, as we say many times. Governance and value systems, on balance and reciprocity. I think Dr. Miguel mentioned something on that, which I really like. So for the UNA food systems, we were thinking on universal food access. And like he said, I think many indigenous communities have already been practicing that. Let me just give you an example with the COVID-19. When many communities didn't have any other option than lock themselves because the lack of infrastructure and medicines, you will think, how would they be living isolated if they couldn't access to the markets outside, or how the old ones would survive when we live in a society that we need to go and work and get money to get our foods, etc. So what I learned from many of these communities is also that, especially the old people, were taken off by the younger generations and by the rest of the community. So there are a lot of values in there that are embedded in the knowledge, in the ways of living, in the systems, in the governance, in the cosmogony, and the territorial management. So if we want to work together in a world that has sustainable practices that adapt to the current conditions, we need to learn from indigenous communities. We also need to learn, when we talk about indigenous knowledge, we are not saying it should be separated from what we call modern Western or scientific knowledge. What we say is like it could be complemented, but we should acknowledge first what is already there, and from there build on and try to complement and strengthen the food systems. So as I mentioned before, like many of the explanations of why they are the guardians of the 80% of the global biodiversity, well, it's linked to many of these values and characteristics of the food systems. So again, they are nutritious. In many times, the foods are seen as something minor, inferior, but there's evidence that we are gathering and that many researchers have been gathering to show that actually many of the foods are nutritious. But we now also moving into an era of superfoods, for example, and we are looking at many of these underutilized crops. But we should pay attention again to indigenous people's food systems. And yeah, well, I think Dr. Miguel mentioned already some things on the Coalition on Indigenous People's Food Systems, and we are working on that now. But one of the first things that we need to highlight is that we need to recognize that indigenous people's food systems are game changers, that we need to think on co-creation of indigenous of knowledge with indigenous peoples and other ways of knowledge if we want to strengthen the food systems, not only of indigenous populations, but also for the world. One of the key points for all this is interculturality of education, food policy, and medicine. That's something that I missed, I'm sorry. But I think when we talk about policies, many times we think of an average policy for everyone, but I think we need to move more on creating suits that fit everyone, right? Like one size does not fit everyone, and we need to think on the value of interculturality. We have learned that the loss of language, that also education has had an influence on the erosion of food systems of knowledge, and we need to sort of reverse that. I think many communities are organizing themselves already to propose from the grassroots levels, but it's also now a time for policymakers and researchers to try to embrace that and learn those lessons and partner and collaborate with indigenous communities. In the end, what we need also is to enable indigenous peoples to participate in policymaking, like Dr. Miguel said, that the coalition that we are promoting now, it's a coalition led by indigenous peoples, and I think that's the way it should be. But we are also inviting more people to join us in this global effort in general. So this is it. If you want to learn much more about the Global Hub on Indigenous People's Food Systems, don't be shy and just send us an email. I'm sharing here the email, and that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for presenting key aspects of sustainability of indigenous people's food systems and insights from the White Wipala paper. I would like now to invite our following speakers who will focus on the diet of the Naga people in Northeast India and exemplify what Tanya just presented. Lungva, you are a director grade scientist at National Institute of Nutrition in India. In which measure the traditional food system of the Naga people provides adequate food and diets, dear Lungva? What are the recommendations that you would like to provide to enhance the food security of the Naga people? The floor is yours. Thank you so much, Lungva. You may be on mute. We cannot hear you.
Lomba, your microphone is off, I think. We couldn't hear your presentation.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, the Nagas of Northeast India. In Northeast India, the Nagas, there are 42 tribes that live in Nagaland, state of Nagaland, Manipur, and a part of Arunachal. Across the international border in Myanmar also there are many Naga tribes. What is important and unique about the Naga tribes is that they are the owners of the land. Unlike the indigenous people in other parts of the world, Nagas own the land that they live in. And this is guaranteed by the Constitution of India. If you look at the land holding system, you will find that the forest land is run by communities, that is 43%, then the cultivation and the June is 37%. This land use also defines how the people, Naga people, source their food. The government owns just 6% of the land in the state of Nagaland. This is just an example. The typical Naga house, and it is the women who are the seed keepers. They also decide what kind of crops will be grown in the fields. Just to highlight the varieties of foods that are used in that are grown in the shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation is the main form of agriculture for the Nagas. There we practice the mixed cropping system. In any given village, 65 to 110 crops are cultivated in June fields, providing dietary diversity to the indigenous population. These crops are harvested at different periods, thereby providing the farmers with sequential harvesting and a variety of foods throughout the year. For example, if you look at the proportion of land that is used in the shifting cultivation, the principal crops occupy 70%, the intermediate crops 20%, minor crops 10%. Principal crops mainly the staple food, cereals, and those other crops that are used to supplement the staple food. For example, yam, the colocation. Here you have, in Nagaland itself, we have documented 110 varieties of colocation, such rich agrobiodiversity. And this food is very important because all parts of this food are used. And also to provide the protein for the people, the grain legumes. The most important grain legumes among the Nagas are the rice beans. Different types of rice beans that varies in color, shape, size. Also, this color beans, which are known for its, which are valued for its taste. It has about 16 varieties. As such, in all these foods that are used by the Nagas, there's so much of agrobiodiversity. For example, even in the chilies, we have documented 52 capsicum land races. The Naga green chili, the hottest chili in the world, and also the Hatay chili. What is unique about this Hatay chili is it grows to about 10 to 12 inches, and it is valued for its aroma, taste, color, and medium spiciness. But the important thing about here is so much of agrobiodiversity, yet the people have now started shifting towards cultivation of commercial crops to supplement their income. In terms of the wild foods, there are so much of wild food resources. And if you look at the Naga tribe, every tribe has different types of foods that are sourced from the forest. Food generation in the forest rely on a deep understanding of the ecosystem seasonality, availability of resources, and its collection with minimum intervention to the ecosystem. Wild plant foods are used by all the tribes, but the specific usage depends on the geographical location and ecology. Hence, it is not uniform among the tribes. I always like to talk about the wild fruits that are used by the people, because in the villages, no commercial fruits comes into the village. So the people rely only on the wild fruits, which is a source of vitamins. Plus, if you look at the varieties of green leafy vegetables, these are not just a source to provide the dietary diversity, but a source of vitamin A, the beta carotene. The Nagas are actually non-vegetarian, but the usage of meat in the village is very, very, very rare because we do not have the butcher houses in the village. The meat comes from the wild game as well as the mushrooms and the insects. Mushrooms provides a lot of vitamin D also in some of these mushrooms. Plus, it gives you a lot of diversity, plus it gives you protein. I wanted to show, I always like to show this picture where the mushroom is as big as its girl. Unfortunately, in the last 2 years or 3 years, this mushroom has stopped growing in the place where it was gathered. We don't know what is the reason behind that. Another important food for the Nagas is the insects. Varieties of insects are used, but the most expensive insect is the carpenter worm. This carpenter worm is valued for its typical aroma and taste, and it can cost anything between $200 to $250 for 100 grams of this insect larvae. The other one, which is again considered a delicacy and an expensive insect, is the giant hornet. This giant hornet larva is also a very important food, but it is also very expensive. So these green leafy vegetables, the wild fruits, the mushrooms, and the insects also generates income for the people. Just to highlight the importance of the food biodiversity and the nutritional status and how it helps, I just wanted to highlight a study that we did in 2016 among the Chakzang tribe. This is one of the Naga tribes. If you look at the food biodiversity, you would see that there's a lot of biodiversity. The red ones represents the wild food. And so a lot of wild food comes into the diet of the Naga people. They cultivate ones are also there, but for example, the mushrooms and insects, everything comes from the wild, but the cereals and millets comes from the cultivation only. If you look at the nutritional status and compare it with India, now you see the red one is the National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau data that gathers the nutritional data from 10 states of the country. If you look at the underweight, you'll see that among the Nagas, the Chakazangs, it's only 10%, whereas in India it is 34.8%. And if you look at the hypertension also, you will see that there is lower prevalence of hypertension. But if you look at the diabetes, there is much, much lower diabetes prevalence. Looking at the children nutritional status in terms of underweight, stunting, and wasting, we see that it is much, much lower among the Chakzangs. 14.4% underweight as compared to 41% in India, stunting 21% among the Chakzangs, 43% among the Indians. And if you look at the micronutrient deficiencies, the iron deficiency anemia is also much lower as compared to India. In terms of vitamin A deficiency, among the children less than 5 years, 32.6% among the Chakzangs, whereas in India it is around 60 to 80%. So we see this clear relationship between dietary diversity and the nutritional status, especially even for the micronutrient status of the population. Now, what is the problem? I'll just give an example of cereals and millets. The problem is that in the recent years, the cultivation of the minor staples like the cereals, like the millets, have come down very, very badly. People are now starting to use only the rice that is cultivated, but the cultivation of rice has also come down because the government is supplying rice at a much subsidized rate through the public distribution system. In terms of the nutrient composition of rice landraces and high-yielding varieties, rice landraces has much higher dietary fiber content. And if you look at the glycemic index of the rice varieties, all the high-yielding varieties has high glycemic index, whereas all the rice land races collected from the Nagas have lower glycemic index. Now, if you look at the micronutrient consequence of the dietary shift from the hand-pumped rice or mixed cereals means rice, millet, and job cereals, which we normally used to have, then you see the consequence in terms of, let us say, iron. When you eat the milk rice, you get only 0.72 milligrams per 100 grams, whereas in hand-pumped rice, it is a little higher. But when you have the mixed cereal of, let us say, job cereals, millets, and rice, then you would have 3.3 milligrams per day. So what are the contemporary issues that are affecting the people? We have a variety of foods that ensures food security, adequate nutrition, and health. But then what is the issue here? The contemporary issues, the indigenous foods still form, including the wild foods, still form an integral part of the Naga diet. But globalization is affecting the lifestyle of the people in many ways. The impact of market has already can be also noticed a significant change in the diet and activity patterns, leading to increased NCDs. From being self-reliant, Nagas are becoming more and more dependent on government social security program. But unfortunately, the governments cannot provide everything to the people, and therefore these security programs has not addressed the need for cash to educate the children, increase assets, and enhance the purchasing power. With increasing exposure to the world and the rising aspirations, the younger people are now seeking better options to improve the economy and give up the labor-intensive subsistence farming. Now, when the younger people migrate to the city looking for better opportunities, what happens? We all know that the knowledge transfer stops there. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that the indigenous people food system is still very good, providing, ensuring food security and adequate nutrition. And this is reflected in the better nutritional status of the Nagas, despite economic and social backwardness. In the recent survey, the National Family Health Survey 4, conducted in 2019-20. The detrimental effect of globalization on Naga food system is already visible and needs a holistic approach to preserve the Naga food system. Mainstreaming these food resources into the current food system and maintaining the sustainability in the production can bring economic benefits to the Naga, as well as preserve food culture, dietary diversity, indigenous knowledge, and resilient agricultural ecosystems. Indigenous foods can be the key to future food and nutrition security by providing the dietary diversity, economic and environmental benefits, especially in the face of climate change, and needs to be included in agriculture policies and programs. The intrinsic value of traditional indigenous foods must be recognized and included in the official systems of measurements and indicators. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Longva, for this very rich presentation. That you put some figures and numbers on what the previous speakers mentioned on the very rich agrobiodiversity found in indigenous people's food system. We also learned that biodiversity is not only limited to agrobiodiversity, but indigenous peoples have vast knowledge on wild species and semi-domesticated species. So thank you so much, Longva. We have now a little change in our agenda, and I would like to invite our last speaker to the technical discussion, Mrs. Mariam Walet Aboubakrin. You are a medical doctor and you belong to the Keltamashek people, and you are also one of the 6 co-principal investigators of the global research program Aramat. Mariam, could you please give us a few examples on the importance of biodiversity for the livelihoods of the Keltamashek and As part of the ARAMAT project, what is your message for the researchers community today? Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks for the convener of this Congress. I mean, the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, and the Alliance of Biodiversity International, SIAT, as well as all those who made this event possible, specifically the session on Indigenous people. Starlasam, good morning. I'm sorry you can hear my daughter's voice, so I can't, this is something not on my control, unfortunately. So I'm joining this morning from the Algonquin and Anishinaabe ancestral territory. Myself, as you said, and I'm Tuareg from Timbuktu, or Keltamashaq as we call ourselves. We practice nomadism as a way of life. In my region, Sahara and Sahel, nomadism responds to a need for a resource management resilient system in an area where the average of rain yearly is 50 millimeters during in the part of the Sahara, and between 200 and 400 millimeters in the area of the Sahel. This is also a region where all beings and non-beings depend on each other. We can't play with those relations nor disbalance them, because that is a matter of death and or life. It's also a matter of continuity of who we are as people. Now, I want to speak about the place of nature beyond only where we can harvest food. Nature for us in the desert is our GPS. It's in the night, the stars in the sky allow us to find our way. They orient us. They guide also us where there is no road sign, there is no stop or any sign of road. The same for the mountain, what we call Yadraran or dune of sand, or the oasis or the trees. That are the signs that guide us to the water and to all the activities that we does there. Livestock, the place of livestock in our life. To speak in global language in the Sahara and Sahel region, most people are not monetary included. This means they deal very rarely with money. They don't have bank accounts. Their only saving are the livestock. They are used not only in the social event, for example, what we call tagalt in my language, Tamashaq, the wedding dowry, is gifted in animals. The same for a welcoming ceremony for a baby that we call ashiof, that is also gifted in animals. So animals products are also used in daily life material, including furniture of the house and home decoration, and as well as women and men jewelries. Beyond their role in social event and ornament, livestock is central to my people's food security. Most of our food comes from animals directly, like milk, meat, butter, cheese, and I will not go into micronutrient that my colleague previously explained well, but that's where we get the micronutrient we need for our for a healthy diet. But indirectly also the animal products are used to in exchange with the neighboring communities with, for example, the non-wide cereal that we don't grow or not grow in the nature, like millet or wheat. Now, also the tradition, I want to mention the traditional medicine. Yet none of the states where the Kaltamashak find themselves have been able to develop a health system that is adapted to their way of life. Any health system targeting nomadic people has to consider two things: the centrality of nomadism in the life of these people and the inclusion of human, animal, and environmental health. We can't only tackle human health without, specifically for nomads, without considering their the animals' health. These are minimum criteria for the success of any health system for my people. In regard to this situation, it is legitimate to ask this question. So how these people are treated there, sir, how they are healed, how do they get treatment? Like most of indigenous peoples, Kaltamashak for millennia has relied on the traditional medicine. The traditional medicine and practices is passed on from generation to generation, and both women, men practice it. Mostly the men intervene in the area of the spiritual, mental, and emotional health, while women are the experts of the physical health. They mostly use products from wild plants, animals from their ecoregion. In case of broken bones, for example, we use as splint wood that we call tifesasin from the local wood. And we also have specific plants that are used in specific other diseases like hepatitis. We use a plant named tahahis, and I can provide later with a scientific name. For my people, environment damages has already a direct effect on people and animals. The loss of biodiversity impacts every dimension of life. There is the equilibrium is already fragile. So any environmental event is coming and hitting exponentially. This is why we have a code of conduct. For example, we don't anything that we don't need from, we don't take it. Like we use very precociously all the elements in the nature. Also, the natural resources are managed and used in a very as not to exhaust them, and that is why also there is a rotational and complementary use of and management of the land. This is why we as pastoralists move and explain, that also explain the diversity of animal in the livestock, like cows, camels, goats. For example, we know that the goats are very resilient species and they easily feed themselves from the acacia, which is one of the trees that are mostly present in our ecosystem. And the cows are mostly feed from the grass, and they are the one we expect from them in the pasture season, in the what we call in French hivernage. And the camel are the one which really adapt to the lack of water and can drive us for long. So because of the centrality of nature and biodiversity to all kinds of life and non-living element on Mother Earth, we need transformative solutions. They include listening for those who lived for millennia with nature, those who developed traditional knowledge on how to live in symbiotic way with nature as part of it, and not only as a reservoir of natural resources. I mean the indigenous peoples. They are scientists, knowledge holders, and have technologies. We need to listen to them. We need to learn from them. We need to give them voice, not aside or as parallel knowledge, but as part of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, with that holistic approach. Most of the co-panelists already mentioned the aspect of holistic approach of indigenous peoples. And this holistic approach is really needed to address global challenges we face, such as climate change, human and animal health. This is what Aramet project is about. In that project, we are a diverse group of indigenous and non-indigenous researchers, youth, elders, women, men, 2S, LGBTQI, indigenous organizations, provincial and territorial government, as well as international organizations like FAO. We are working together to produce knowledge and innovation that can improve the way in which biodiversity and health well-being are holistically stewarded in Canada and globally. Aramet project is also partner of the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food System hosted by FAO, and which my colleague already introduced you, which aim to be a space for dialogue of knowledge that will gather evidence-based contribution on indigenous people's food system to inform policy. How that is possible? A concrete example is the Waipala paper, which is the result of collective work by indigenous people's representatives and expert scientists, researchers, and UN staff. This paper has been used by the member of the Global Hub as a rationale for the contribution of indigenous people's approach to food, which will contribute to the resilience and sustainability of food systems worldwide, as well as supporting the well-being of indigenous peoples and to influence the food system summit process. One of the outcomes of this research and advocacy work is the creation of a coalition on indigenous food system, which has two main goals. And the ambassador of Mexico already talked about the coalition, but let me tell you about the two main goals of the coalition. The goal one is to respect, recognize, protect, and strengthen indigenous food systems across the world. And the goal two is to disseminate and scale up indigenous knowledge and good practices from indigenous people's food systems with potential to transform global food system at large. And in conclusion, the last UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirms that confirmed what indigenous peoples were alerting us on. And the land also was telling us the land is not healthy. There is an urgency of transformative actions, and these actions should first elevate indigenous people's knowledge with their leadership. Second, support financially and politically existing initiatives like the Coalition on Indigenous Food Systems, the Global Hub on Indigenous Food Systems, and projects like Aramet project. And thirdly, transform current siloed approaches to address global issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, poverty, hunger by adopting holistic approaches. Tanumet, thank you, and I look forward to the next part of this session, the Q&A and in-depth conversation. Tanumet,
Thank you so much, Mariam. It was a very interesting presentation. I think the knowledge from you people really show how biodiversity is really linked to not only diets and food security, but also resilience, culture, health of indigenous peoples, and overall livelihoods and well-being. And thank you so much for presenting this very interesting projects on indigenous-led research and how we can together co-create knowledge. So thank you so much for your contribution, Mariam. I would like now to please start the Q&A questions. We have a session, we have about 15 minutes. And so I invite the speakers to please turn on your camera and I will pick some questions that we received. And some of them are directly addressed to some of the experts, and some others are more general. So please raise your hands in case you would like to answer some of them.
Can I start?
Please go ahead. Please, what is the question you would like to answer to?
This is a question from Teresa about the shifting cultivation. Here, I just want to make it very clear that the land belongs to the people. There is actually nothing like a ban. If we want to continue, we can continue, and we are still continuing. Because the government cannot stop us from utilizing the land that belongs to us. But the community decided that we should now, lower the usage of land for shifting cultivation. Yes, we have documented many varieties of foods that are grown in the shifting cultivation, including the agrobiodiversity that exists for each of these fruit. The only problem is, like I said, because of the need for cash, and the people want to, increase their income. So they have now shifted towards commercial crops, and they have stopped. In a large extent, they have stopped cultivating the normal crops that we normally cultivate. This is detrimental to the preservation of the food system of the Nagas. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Longva. I have also another question. Under which condition can indigenous knowledge be documented while respecting their holistic understanding of food systems? And another one that relates to the same idea of knowledge is, to what extent or what parts of is traditional generalism to other contexts? In effect, what is the value of traditional knowledge beyond a given indigenous community? Does any one of our speakers want to take this ones?
I can take that, maybe in terms, in relation with the land usage of the Nagas. The land is owned by the people, that means the community, and the land usage, protection, and agroecology is also governed by the traditional system of land governance that has been passed on through generations. But whatever land use, it is respectful to the ecology of the people there, of the region there. This is from our Naga perspective.
Thank you. I will ask a few more questions. Jan, I see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to take the floor? We cannot hear you, and I wonder if, Longva, you can turn off your mic so that maybe we can reduce the echo with the other speakers. Thank you. Jan, the floor is yours.
Hi, and sorry, I was wondering whether I can comment on the question about traditional knowledge as a non-indigenous person. I don't know if you will allow me. I think you will agree with me that if that we will never question what is the value of a piece of art or a written book, because anything that contributes to knowledge in a way has intrinsic value to advance the progress of humankind, whether indigenous or not indigenous. So I think the question of what is the usefulness of indigenous traditional knowledge beyond indigenous peoples, in a way, is a question that we will not ask in other contexts, no? And it will be important to rephrase it. I think indigenous people's knowledge has one advantage over other forms of knowledge, and is the fact of continuation on time. We have different experiences in humankind of knowledge generation that has been discontinued, or that have taken us to dead ends throughout history. And there's strong evidence, and this is well documented. I think the indigenous people's advantage is the fact that their knowledge has been alive for thousands of years. we are in I don't like to use the word Western, because I think Western culture is not a precise term, but I will say dominant culture and dominant forms of what is perceived as the ruling knowledge and the ruling codes and frameworks. They are based nowadays in written form. And this is very often detrimental to indigenous peoples, but not only, also to pastoralists and to peoples all over the world, who are millions of people. We are just not talking of few individuals that maintain their knowledge systems alive through storytelling and through oral knowledge that goes both inter and intra-generational. And this is something that, unless dominant scientists start to understand and start to incorporate, they will disregard a tremendous knowledge that has been generated for generations by humanity, that today it is not adequately being integrated, neither in policy discussions, not in the mainstream educational system. And this is a tremendous net loss for humanity, whether indigenous or not indigenous.
Thank you very much, Jan, for your remarks. I have another question. Oh, Frank, you want to speak? Please, you have the floor. Unmute yourself, please. I think you still have you for mute.
Sorry, I do not have time, but to add to what Jan has said, one of the major problems that has taken over civilization today, and that has led us to these sort of serious planetary problems, is this notion of civilizing. And that is one set of knowledge system is the one that is the corrective measures. But I think indigenous people's knowledge, the basis is their as Miriam and others have said, is their connection to nature and everything that has come as part of nature. And probably today, more than ever, we need this if we are to get back to the challenges that COP26 and others have placed before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I see, Mariam, you had your hand raised. Do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, I can just add a few things about the importance of indigenous knowledge beyond indigenous communities themselves. When we saw data from IPBS and Tanya remind us earlier, the stewardship of indigenous peoples, how much of the remaining biodiversity is in the very few territories that are inhabited by indigenous peoples. And that is not something that is benefiting only for indigenous peoples. This is humanity, that is humanity's lengths. So it allows to all the humanity to breathe. This is one of the add. And if I can also take one example of one of the global challenges today. In our knowledge, there is a way of resolving how to resolve conflicts, and with the colonization and with the impact of dominant systems, now our ways of resolving conflicts is put it away, and that is why also we are seeing conflict, for example, inter-community conflict, or chronic conflict that can take place for more than 10 years. In case of my own homeland, like in Mali, we are facing the last crisis now more than 10 close to 10 years now. So this is one of the really add for not only our people, but to whole humanity what indigenous knowledge can bring. But there are a lot of things that I can share. The time is limited, just to see also out of the known things, or just write the biodiversity or agrobiodiversity. It goes beyond all that.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for complementing this question with your answer. I have a final question to our speakers. I will combine actually two. Will the indigenous people's food system survive once they become global? And how to convince the Naga people to revert to traditional shifty cultivation agriculture? The floor is yours. I don't know who wants to take, maybe Lonva, you want to take this question, and other experts also, if you want to answer to this question.
Okay, thank you, Anne. You know, I have been talking about how to actually maintain the indigenous people's food system. We need to provide alternative to the aspirations of the people. How can we provide that kind of alternative? A lot of these indigenous foods have potential to be exploited. Scientific evidence must be brought in order so that the people can exploit the potentials, the commercial potentials, the nutritional potentials of these crops that are there in their ecosystem, as well as in the wild. For example, I was talking to you about how people are generating income from the collection of wild foods from the forests, including insects, and how expensive some of these insects are. You know, the means of generation and then cultivating all these kind of foods so that the people has the kind of income that they are looking for. Then we can see that this indigenous people's food system will continue. But unless we are able to provide such alternative, people are aspiring to get better income, to get better positions, and therefore they will move up, because the indigenous people's food system also requires hard labor, backbreaking labor. So an alternative that is not just viable, but that is actually inclusive and requires people to want to protect and continue the system.
Thank you very much, Lonva. I will ask Mariam and Frank to respond to the question in really 30 minutes, please, and then we go to the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think if I can add something to this question is really we need to put safeguard on how indigenous people's food system is brought, because if we, I already heard about concerns on indigenous people's food systems, like the quinoa, which is now widely widely exploited, and one of the risks is even some indigenous peoples will not access to their own food at the end. So we have to be really cautious on that, to respect the natural way of harvesting, the linkage, this harmony that indigenous peoples were keeping, and the seasonal rotation that is kept on how we harvest, because we don't want to damage the nature. Everything is done precautiously, and we need to also have a human rights based approach here, including the intellectual property of indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much for highlighting these very important points. Frank, you would like to speak 30 seconds, please.
I think the important thing is not to join the bandwagon, but to change the narrative. And I think we have to make that effort. It is not the question of bringing science to tell us what is good about us. We may use science, important, but for us to recognize that there is substance. And we were doing something in Northeast India also, where we are looking at school meals, in which we are trying to say, look at the food that's available in your village, rather than what government is giving to you, rather than what you can buy. And we found through our mapping, there's a lot of food. We don't need a scientist to come and tell us. The communities know about it. And then you solve that problem at the local level and take it up higher and higher. Your problem and my problem is that we have people sitting at policy levels whose thinking is only of one mindset, of one knowledge system, and who know nothing, who care nothing, and who do not want to know about the other alternative. Change the narrative and you can change the whole thing, and you will find that we then can become game changers.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this very powerful statement. I think we will stay with you and Jan for the way forward. So Frank, we presented you at the beginning of the session. You're an Indigenous leader from the Kashi people, and you are the coordinator of the Indigenous Partnership on Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty. Jan Fernandez de la Rinoa, you are head of the Indigenous Peoples Unit at FAO, and both of you will kindly provide us some way forwards. What are the take-home message that you would like to have for the Congress today? Thank you. Frank, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Anne. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
I've just taken notes of what different people have said, and this is my takeaway home. The speakers of this session have strongly and consistently highlighted that if indigenous food systems are not mainstream by policymakers, by research centers, by our conventional methodologies that we have, we will run the risk of putting the world at a dangerous position, as His Excellency Miguel and Mariam stated. We also heard a number of examples of the rich agrobiodiversity of indigenous people's food systems. For us and for FAO, it was stated also by Massimo that there can be no agriculture without agrobiodiversity. We heard that we are a part of nature, and we were reminded of that our health is connected to the health of our animals, and that we need to give a voice to those who have that knowledge and who have been carrying it from one generation to the other. But we also heard of the threats to indigenous peoples that come from markets, as Longwa said, that come from violation of rights and the loss of traditional knowledge and the threats on biodiversity, health, and diet. We were reminded by Longwa that there are better nutritional status amongst the indigenous people of Nagaland, and that indigenous peoples are not vulnerable, but are often put in situations of vulnerability. I was very pleased that FAO and the indigenous speakers affirmed that there can be no agriculture without agrobiodiversity. And I think the statement needs to be repeated again and again in this conference. And then there can be no agrobiodiversity without indigenous peoples. And I hope that this conference will state very clearly. We, on our part, will play our role and play it innovatively, as Miriam said, to promote an intercultural approach where the knowledge of contemporary science and traditional knowledge are blended equally. Several speakers made reference to the Vipala paper on indigenous peoples, which was collectively drafted, as Tanya said, to help non-indigenous scientists get a better understanding of our food systems. We are proud that we have been part of the coalition, and as a follow-up step to the UN Food Systems Summit, to have a better understanding, as Tanya said, and respect and recognition and inclusion for the protection of indigenous people's food system. We look up to the leadership of His Excellency Miguel as the chair of the group of friends of IP and Room. in Rome. And we will all like, and I would like at this time to join him and call all of you, whether in government, in civil society, in academic institutions, to join together this coalition, because this is a coalition that can bring a game-changing solution if you give the instrument to do so, or if not, then they will do it on their own. We hope that the participation in the food system in the COP26 will create the needed environment for a system that is more connected with nature and its agrobiodiversity. These are the few messages that I took from that meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for the very powerful statement. Again, it's very an honor to have you with us today. Frank, would you like, Jan, sorry, would you like to have very final words to this session so that we can close? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I have three take-home messages just to complement, I think, the excellent closure that Fran has done. The first one is from the FAO Indigenous Peoples Unit. We would like to congratulate Biodiversity for the celebration of this very much needed Agrobiodiversity Congress, particularly right after the COP. I think it's more needed than ever. I would like to thank, of course, all the participants, Marian, Lombal, the speakers, Tanya, Fran, and of course the Ambassador Miguel from Mexico, and Massimo Torero. I think what is very clear, and that's my first take-home message after the gratitude, is the need for collective action. I think nobody has the overall truth, and we are seeing how dogmas and paradigms that we were following blindly 30 years ago are actually collapsing. And we need to find new ways of coming up with new alternatives that are innovative. I think Lomba talked a detail about shifting cultivation. And many years ago, there was a scientist that visited some shifting cultivation fields and say, oh, this is a very primitive way of agriculture and food production. And that comment, which it comes out of utterly ignorance on how shifting cultivation operates, has actually demonized a system that today is proving more and more that is more resilient and that preserves biodiversity much better than monocultures. I have never heard scientists go to a monocropping of maize in the middle of the Amazon or soya beans and say, oh, this is very primitive. So my second take-home message is the importance of revisiting and reviewing the conceptual frameworks that we all have and what our perception of what is right and wrong. I think climate change and the climate crisis and the escalation of biodiversity is telling us loud and clear that we need to change the way that we are doing business. I think the fact that the recent UN Food Systems Summit, the motto was how to transform food systems into sustainable and resilient, is another way of saying that our current food systems at global level are neither resilient nor sustainable. So there's an overall realization for this, and we need to reach out to include new ways and new alternatives of approaching food generation. And my third take-home message is that collective action is really in need of dedicated research by institutions, by centers all over the world that put indigenous peoples at the center of the research agendas. We cannot continue doing research on monocrops, and we cannot continue coming up with hybrid varieties of seeds when there are myriads of foods that indigenous peoples are teaching us that are edible that we are ignoring. This is really a humankind nonsense that we are doing very much in the search for profit quite often. And we need to revisit all of this. What is being profit for some is it means food insecurity for others. What it is benefit for some companies, in some cases, it means climate change for communities that are living in other parts of the world. Unless we start looking at the net benefit for humankind and we include everyone in the solution, neither research, nor policies, nor educational programs will be inclusive and will not be conducive to move the agenda forward. It's unlikely that we will meet the SDGs in 2030 unless we come up with collective action that includes indigenous peoples and pastoralists as knowledge holders that has solutions to share with all of us. Thank you so very much, Anne, and congratulations for the event, and again to Biodiversity and the government of Italy.
Thank you very much, Sean, for these final words. I think we have all a take-home message for reflecting and continue the discussions today at the Congress. I would like to thank very much the participants, the speakers, the Alliance, and of course, colleagues in Dev Global who helped us to organize this event. Thank you very much to all and see you very soon. Bye.